You're listening to the African Camp Fire Stories Podcast. Welcome. This is Episode 1, Podcast Introduction. There is a famous quote about history. It is from Alexandra Herzen, and it says, open quote, "History is the autobiography of a madman," close quote. If one looks back at some of the key events in world history, it's not hard to find at least one madman behind each one of them. Hello, I go by Tegzilla, and I'll be the mad voice man and narrator behind the African Camp Fire Stories Podcast. The African Camp Fire Stories Podcast is a labor of love for me and my partner, the other madman behind this podcast. And we hope very much that you will enjoy the stories we'll be sharing. We also hope that you'll stay with us for what is hopefully a long journey of us sharing African history stories with you. The purpose of this journey for us is quite simple: to share the history of this great continent of Africa with everyone across the world. We will strive to tell the stories about African history in the best way we can. This is our promise. We will strive to give everyone who will make an appearance in our stories a fair share, an equal voice. We will show no undue disfavor or favor to anyone. There will be no instances where we set out to smear anyone or any group of people unfairly. Simply stated, we will present the facts about places, about people, about their times, and about their behavior. We will take no sides in any of our stories. At times we're going to be serious, but we hope that the fun we will have had in planning, plotting, thinking, and executing this podcast will also come through and infect you too, so that you as the listener will have fun while learning about serious African history topics. This might be the right time to quote ancient Greek historian Herodotus, regarded by many as the father of history. Open quote. "If a man insisted on always being serious and never allowed himself a bit of fun and relaxation, he would go mad or become unstable without knowing it." Close quote. So, we will try and follow this important lesson from the father of history. And for our lady listeners out there, I'm so sorry for the epithet father of history. What can I say? Ancient people, not so enlightened, right? So, to bring this title to a proper 21st century version, we will call Herodotus the parent of history. Fair? Okay, let me proceed. While we are talking about ancient people and their politically incorrect manner of assigning titles to historians, in this introductory episode, I'll be remiss if I didn't mention that any telling of history, and even listening to history or reading history, has to try by all means to mentally put the people in those stories, their thoughts, their behavior, in the times they lived in, lest we find ourselves judging the actions of these men and women and their times based on the criteria and parameters of our own time. In case you're wondering about the name of the podcast, there is a fondness amongst us Africans, well, at least those Africans that are capable of fondness, for the legend of the village campfire. Around the campfire, men, women, and children would sit in the evenings and listen to tales. Tales about history, tales about grandparents, tales about ancestors, tales about fairies, and many other types of tales. The storyteller would preferably be old and grey. In these instances of old Africa, the campfire represented warmth, the coming together of people, fun, light-heartedness, and enlightenment through the sharing of knowledge. We hope that this is what the African Campfire Stories Podcast will come to represent for you in your own life too. Before we close this introduction episode, we would like to communicate one last point about how the podcast will be structured. Please note that we will not be following a serialized chronological way of telling our stories. So what does that mean? Many history podcasts out there do a history of a country, say history of Cambodia, history of Chile, etc. They then tell the history of those countries starting from the very beginning. We will not be following that approach. There's nothing wrong with following that approach. There are many very good history podcasts out there that do that, like the legendary History of Rome podcast or the History of England podcast. If, for instance, our podcast was titled The History of Egypt or The History of Angola or something along those lines where one country was the focus, we would most likely have to also follow a serial approach. But because we have to tackle an entire continent, we felt that it would be better for us if we use the approach that we are going to use, which is to choose certain African historical events. Sometimes we will choose historical periods, sometimes we will choose historical figures, and then based on such choices, we will develop our topics and our content. This is the end of the episode titled Podcast Introduction. You can follow the African Camp Fire Stories podcast on social media to get the latest updates and episodes and much, much more. On Twitter, African Camp Fire Stories. On Facebook, African Camp Fire Stories. On Instagram, African Camp Fire Stories. Please also visit our website, www.africancampfirestories.com, for the latest updates, episodes, information, pictures, and maps that are supplementaries to every episode. Our very first topic will begin from the next episode, episode 2 of this podcast. The series is called Cold War Pawns. On episode 2, we will introduce the series. We hope you'll enjoy it. Stay tuned. See you next time.